Hi, everyone. We are doing the second installment of our Interviews with Foucauldians series for this semester. And today I am here with a close friend of mine and a colleague who works also on Foucault, among other things, Becca Longtin. So if you can just introduce yourself to the students.
Hi, I'm Dr. Becca Longtin. I am an associate professor at the State University of New York in New Paltz. And I guess I'm a Foucauldian.
Yeah, well, and you're more than just a Foucauldian because you work on a number of figures. And it just so happens that today we'll focus on Foucault, but we can talk about a number of related figures. Um,
Yeah.
so let's start from the background that you are sort of using to pivot into Foucault, and we'll get to the Foucault later.
Mhm.
But tell us about what your intellectual interests are in the grand scheme of things and the sorts of questions that you started asking theoretically, philosophically, culturally, that eventually may have led to Foucault.
Wonderful. So I work a lot on philosophy of art and phenomenology, mainly because I'm very interested in just what experience is, how we experience the world, how we make sense of ourselves through experience, how we connect to others. And experience ends up being very, very complicated when we look at it. Um, there's a lot of divergent ways of experiencing the world. We use experience as kind of the foundation for understanding things, right? Experience kind of gives us knowledge of things around us. And if we don't have direct experience of something, we sometimes think our knowledge of that thing is just purely academic or speculation. And so we really prize experience as this sort of foundation uh, for understanding. However, there's a lot of ways that experience is quite slippery and not very reliable. And thinkers like Foucault show us that these things we take to be very stable, actually, if we trace them throughout history, end up being very unstable and changing a great deal. So this is sort of how I approach philosophy.
Well, and that's an interesting starting point, especially for Foucault, because early on in his life, Foucault, as you know, begins really interested in phenomenological questions. Some of his earliest work really is about experience and existence, engaging figures like Heidegger and Husserl. And later in life, as he starts sort of developing his own archaeological, genealogical method, he breaks away from phenomenology. And so your own trajectory into Foucault has this parallel with Foucault's own trajectory. And so it's interesting to think about the connection between those two things. So in terms of your work, you mentioned that you did work in experience, phenomenology, and the philosophy of art. So let's begin there, because I know you wrote a dissertation about art theory or philosophy of art. I'm not sure what the right term you prefer for describing that work. And I have several students who are explicitly interested in the philosophy of art. And so can you tell us a little bit about your dissertation project?
Yeah, so my dissertation was called Transforming the Sensible, and I wrote it on two figures in German philosophy, William Dilthey, who's late 19th century, very early 20th century, and Martin Heidegger, who's a 20th century thinker. And essentially what I was trying to argue is that there's this shift in the concept of what the sensible is, what we experience through our senses, and that in both thinkers we have this way of looking at our sensory experience as not something that's separate from emotion or sort of more intellectual or abstract concepts. And so if you think about what you're experiencing around you, it you never just experience something, right? There's always a feeling with it. There's always an emotion with it. And there's always a sort of framework, a conceptual framework that we're using to make sense of something. And so I think that in both thinkers, we see that the reason they're approaching our sensory experience in this way and sort of intertwining our senses and emotions and thoughts in a particular way is because they both take art very seriously. So, for example, Dilthey uses narrative to think about our relation to history and memory and sort of the way our mind works. And so we can use literary narration and the sort of tools that literature gives us for understanding what it is like to think about your life or remember something from the past or try to create a history about a particular event. And also when we think about trying to understand just what it's like walking around looking at the world, we can use painting to understand this, particularly when we have someone like Van Gogh who intensifies texture and color and all these different ways. We can think about how we actually experience sight. Like, what is it like to be in a, sun-drenched field full of olive trees? And even if Van Gogh's painting is maybe not realistic in terms of representation, what he's really capturing is that feel of being in that field. And so this is something that really interested me, is how art allows us to experience how we experience. That was what I was trying to get at.
Okay, so thinking about art as a microcosm of experience more generally, is that fair?
Kind of, yeah. I would say almost like more than just a microcosm, a sort of intensification of it. It's
Okay.
almost like experience is folded in on itself. And you are also, it frames experience in a particular way where suddenly you're stepping back from it and just observing it in a different way. So art kind of reorients us to experience what we're already experiencing it, but more intensely, more focused, maybe more articulately too.
And so it might be fair to say that all experience, so when we think about aesthetic experience, we think about, our experience of objects of art, like listening to a melody or seeing a painting in a museum. But it seems like where your research takes us is the claim that all experience has this aesthetic element, in the sense that it's never separate from emotion and thought and concepts. You never have just like a brute sensory experience. There is always that sort of folding of experience onto itself in any experiential moment. Would that follow from your work?
I think so. And I think I think what I want to point out is that philosophers need to study artists. Like that
Yeah.
artists are perhaps better at paying attention to nuanced experiences that you might have and
Mhm.
finding ways to articulate them or focus on them. And that, and in fact, a lot of phenomenologists do write about art. And I think that's why,
Hmm.
is that it helps us approach that experience. And I think, artists would very much think it's self-evident that any everyday experience you're having is potentially something that is for art, right? It's something that can be transformed into art. There's sort of material for art all around us.
That's interesting.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't speak on behalf of artists, but I think some of the things I'm saying might be more obvious to artists than to philosophers.
But I really like that because, one of the questions that we often forget to ask, especially those of us who are in philosophy in this discipline, is that we tend to take for granted this assumption that the people who are authorized or who have the authority to speak about existence or experience are philosophers. But
Yeah.
depending on your interpretation of experience, it might turn out to be that the real authorities might actually be somewhere else, right? Like it might be the artist and the musician, maybe the dancer as well, who really emerges as having a kind of connection to experience that reveals something about experience that maybe traditional philosophy doesn't. Um,
Yeah.
and so I kind of really like that. And I know you've published, if I'm not mistaken, about Van Gogh in particular.
Yeah.
And so I'll make sure to ask you for maybe a copy of that to make available to my students who are
Definitely.
interested. And so to try to connect this back now, you begin, working on these questions about aesthetics and sensibility and art and the meaning of experience, working with Dilthey and Heidegger and maybe other figures in the neighborhood. And then now, at some point, you've also developed an interest in Foucault. And so I'm wondering how that movement happened, or what was it about Foucault's work that drew you to it? Was there a specific book? Was there a specific solution to a problem? How did you move from these phenomenological thinkers to Foucault? Or is there more continuity there than maybe I'm letting on by asking this question?
So I did, The Order of Things was what I read of Foucault that I think I read in my second year of grad school. And sorry about my dog.
Oh no, it's all good.
So, and I think of Foucault as really putting almost like a thorn in my brain that I didn't know how to work out. And so I turned to Foucault kind of later after I finished my dissertation and my PhD. And I published an article on the order of things where I was working through sort of what I thought about Foucault and his method. And I think in particular, so Foucault helps us to really step back from thought and the world in this way. He gives us these enormous sort of historical trajectories, right? Where he looks at a sort of institution or practice or idea that we have now and that we take to be pretty firm, pretty unquestionable. And he then uses history to kind of shatter it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always approached philosophy in a very sort of historical way. That's how I was trained. I was introduced to philosophy in high school, actually, and we would always, we had a class called Humane Letters, which was history, philosophy, theology, and literature together. And it was, I think, a 2 or 3 hour class every day where you would read original texts. And
And this
so
is in high school?
this was in high
Okay,
school, yeah.
I assume you went to a not public high school.
Yeah, this was not
Okay.
the public school system. This was a very small school, actually, a very small, very idealistic, wonderful school. And so I was used to sort of reading history and literature, like all these things together in a historical period. So early American literature, history, and political theory together,
Mm-hmm.
or like the Renaissance, or we did like ancient Greek philosophy and history, Thucydides, and stuff like that as well. So Foucault attracted me because he's taking you through the history of ideas, but he's mapping it out in ways that I had never seen before. And so all these narratives I had about history, all these concepts I had about where our ideas came from, like what is the sort of workshop in which these ideas emerge, Foucault just sort of threw all of that away after
And
many years of studying philosophy, and I had to figure out what to do with him.
well, and I think there's a lot of us who have read Foucault in different contexts at different points in our lives, in different settings, who have a similar experience of this thing that you've called shattering, where you have some commitments either to an institution or to a thought or to an idea, and then to see them get historicized. There's a really interesting thing that happens in terms of your own subjectivity where you think, oh, this thing that I'm so committed to wasn't always that. And it wasn't even always there. It might be a relatively recent creation. And so the method of Foucault is something that I want us to talk a little bit more about. But before we go there, I want to show my students this photo that you sent me. So I'm going to do a screen share. And this, can you tell me what we're about to look at, just so that my students know?
Oh, so I sent David a photograph of my this was like my journal I would keep. It wasn't my class notes. I would, um, I would keep intellectual journals that were kind of mapping my reactions to things and where I was with different ideas as I learned in grad school. And Foucault really messed up my brain, as you can tell from this. Yeah, I just, he, like I said, he took everything I thought I knew and he messed with it in this way where I couldn't put it back together in the same way ever again.
And just for the students who may not be able to read it, it's a note. I don't know when was this from, roughly?
2009, March
Okay,
2009.
so a decade ago, and it says, "Are optimism, belief, joy, truth, beauty, and goodness still available to me? Or is everything shifting sand? F. Foucault, he screwed up my life." And I think that's a really candid and kind of meaningful little piece of personal, I don't know what you would call it, personal memorabilia, of this experience that you had reading Foucault, and as you say, shifting, seeing the sand underneath you shift. And that's an interesting metaphor in itself, because in the order of things, very famously, towards the end, Foucault, well, for my students who are not familiar with this book and we're not reading it for the class, in the order of things, which is Foucault's, arguably his masterwork, the work that really propelled him into European stardom. Um, in this book, he traces the history of systems of thought, of the way in which man has understood himself by creating discourses about life, labor, and language. And so he traces how life, labor, and language, these concepts, have shifted across various eras. And the reason that I'm bringing this up here is just because of that connection with sand, because at the end, Foucault closes with this really beautiful image in which he says, this figure, the figure of man, that we tend to know what we think we know what it means. I forget the exact quote, but it's something like, it might turn out to be nothing but a figure in the sand that disappears with the coming of the tide, or something like this. I don't know if you remember that quote better than I do.
Yeah, it's like something about the waves washing over this figure and
Yes.
disappearing in the sand for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it just reminded me of this passage, this image of a figure in the sand that we tend to think of as written in stone, and then the water of history comes and washes it away, and something fundamentally new becomes possible, which is sort of the spirit of Foucauldian genealogy. Um, and so let me now ask you a question, following up on the last thing you mentioned about Foucault's method. And so you had studied history, you had studied art and literature, often paying attention to sort of the period, right? Like the spirit or the personality of Greek antiquity, the personality of the Renaissance as a period in time. Um, and you mentioned that Foucault really upset or destabilized what you thought about history because of his method. And I'm just wondering whether you can say a few more things about that, because for my students who are reading Foucault for the first time, I think, as for me, when I was a graduate student, the methodology of Foucault can be a little tricky. So how does it differ from other historical methods that you had encountered before? What was new for you about Foucauldian methodology?
Great. That's a great question. So, if I had already mentioned, right, that was the approach I did in high school. My college was very similar. My college had a sort of great books program where you're reading sort of classic Western texts that have been put on a pedestal as great books, classics that everyone should read. And then I went to a graduate program right before they kind of changed their Emory. I went to Emory with David, and it was I went at a time where they still had a historical comprehensive test that you take to qualify from your MA to your PhD, your qualifying exam, was not based on your dissertation research. It was based on a large list of books you were supposed to read. Again, these sort of being canonical texts. And so I think the way I was taught to do the history of ideas is there's like a continuity almost, like there's a tradition you're a part of, and you almost have like this intellectual inheritance. And so it really emphasizes continuity, and it emphasizes focusing on, I think maybe this wasn't so much at the graduate level, but at my undergraduate and high school level, there was a lot of emphasis on like this vision of humanity, like what remains the same about humanity throughout all the ages. Like
Yes.
what, like what are we as humanity? And Foucault takes that and he's like, well, this concept of the human is really only a few hundred years old, or it's only 100 years old, because we really have to look at, the rise of biology. And so he takes this beautiful like continuity, this idea of an unending tradition that we're all writing together, and fragments it. He just chops
Mhm.
it up. And the other thing he shows you is, I think, like when you read the history of ideas, I think, like whenever you're kind of going to ideas and reading, you're looking for something, right? You're looking for some sort of answer. And so you want to find a sort of necessity there, like this is the way to think about this.
Great.
And Foucault shows you there's no necessary way to think about anything. Like there's contingency. And so a lot of times when he's showing you history isn't continuous, it's broken into these different sort of ways of seeing the world, different ways of speaking about the world, these different sort of tables of knowledge that have almost, they have, very little in common with each other. And the break from one way of seeing things to the next way of seeing things comes from these unexpected places, like Don Quixote. He talks about Don Quixote as kind of indicating where the break between this sort of previous period and what he calls the classical period, which is the 17th and 18th century. Like, so he's looking at literature, and he uses things like paintings, like Las Meninas, to kind of give us this paradigm for what is it like to see the world when you're in this classical era. Like, and so he's using all these different tools to show us how very different we see the world now than the way people used to see it, and also that it will fundamentally shift again, and we don't know how. And so you don't have these sort of firm anchors that
Yeah.
I used to think we had in sort of studying, the history of ideas. And like it's almost like history makes you more confused. It doesn't make you more firm about your beliefs. It doesn't make you have greater confidence in that these ideas are true. It kind of shows you how ideas come and go in these different ways, and it's fascinating, but it also means that um, we can't kind of speak about humanity in the same way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's something really, there is a dangerous element to Foucault, or rather, maybe dangerous is not the right word, but there is something unsettling about reading Foucault, especially because, as you say, it takes away the anchors, it takes away the ballast, and not just of oneself as a person reading, but of your historical period, of the things that your time and your culture have told you you can truly rest on.
Yes.
And so I really like this, these 2 points that you're making, for example, that with Foucault, even the concept of what it means to be a human being, or the figure of man, that grows out of the Renaissance and then gets sort of exalted in the 17th and 18th centuries. Even this figure of man, or the human, just doesn't have traction beyond a very limited historical period. And when you start seeing that getting relativized, or historically relativized, it can leave you sort of like grasping at straws for an anchor to ground you. And you know, for some of my students who may be familiar with some of the criticisms of Foucault, one of the criticisms of Foucault, of course, is that, you know, once you relativize something so foundational as the continuity of humanity throughout time, then you're just left with a completely relativistic universe in which nothing is true and nothing is false. And so it becomes this tricky, I think it's a really tricky aspect of Foucault to figure out whether there is something that cuts throughout history, whether there's some constant, or whether really the shift from one historical period to another is just absolute, incommensurable, and completely contingent. And I don't know if you have thoughts about that, about where Foucault lands in that really difficult question that scholars are still debating to this day, you know, 40 years after Foucault's death.
Yeah, I don't have any firm answers, to be honest. But I also think that sometimes there's a tendency, like, so foundationalism can be in some ways just as dangerous as relativism. And so when people get really nervous, like, oh no, relativism, people can go around in the streets murdering everyone because what's right or wrong? It's like, that's a very poor
Yeah.
understanding of relativism. I think, I think Foucault also gives us these like wonderful analyses of like power and power relations. Like there's a lot of resources for using Foucault as a tool to shape the world in a way we want it. Like I think, you know, he gives us this way. He does shake up what we take to be essential, but I think some of the things we take to be essential do need to be shaken up, because really the structure of the world we live in is very much a structure that disenfranchises and oppresses a lot of people. And so
Mhm.
in some ways, maybe that foundation needs to be destroyed for something else. And that's the Nietzsche in me coming out.
Yeah.
So
Well, and my students, by the time they watch this video, they will have read Foucault's essay on Nietzsche genealogy history. And that's where that contingency, this contingent reading of history really comes through as one of the legacies of Nietzsche via Foucault, where Foucault is reading Nietzsche and sort of picking that that aspect of the Nietzschean corpus, which is that these things that we take to be foundational didn't need to be at all. There's no necessity to them. There is no logical necessity, and there's no historical necessity to them. And so things could be otherwise. And this is where a lot of people place this sort of ethics of Foucault, where once you relativize or historicize, I prefer the term historicize just because relativism gets you into all kinds of side debates that maybe are not most helpful. But once you start historicizing foundational concepts or so-called foundational concepts, then the things that you take to be foundational in your present moment suddenly start looking like, hey, this is up for debate, this is up for grabs, and I don't have to accept the status quo because things have been different in the past in a very fundamental way. And so things can once again radically change for contingent reasons. So it
yeah,
makes sort of like, it introduces the element of play and resistance into an otherwise sort of continuous flow of historical necessity.
totally. I think that is definitely a beautiful way of putting it. And that's where the sort of hope in this genealogical method lies. Yeah.
And so now let's enter into the last stage of this interview, which is you've done work on the archaeology, on the archaeology of knowledge and the order of things, which are Foucault's, you know, they really are his most difficult books, especially the order of things, which I am not assigning in my class, but which I've read and you've read, and I think we've talked about it in the past. It's just such a difficult book, one of the most difficult ones that I've read um, in in the canon of Western philosophy, and That's one Foucault, but there are many other aspects of the Foucauldian corpus. You know, you mentioned there is his work in power relations, in disciplinary power, his work on the prison, his work on the clinic. Later in his life, he'll turn mostly to the ancients to try to write about practices of the self and how we reform the self, and sort of the self as a work of art, which I guess would be a connection to your earlier work on art, maybe. Um, but you've been recently using Foucault to think about post-colonial theory and post-coloniality, and in particular, if this is right, sort of Caribbean, um, like the Caribbean experience of colonialism. And so I'm wondering whether we can talk a little bit about that, about how you've brought together, or you are bringing together, your interest in Foucault with post-colonial theory, which a couple of my students have also an interest in. So there is a lot of overlap here.
Wonderful. Yeah. So Sylvia Wynter is one of the Afro-Caribbean thinkers that I am reading a lot now and trying to think with her um, about history and the sort of historical narratives we have about our past. And so if we, in the order of things, Foucault argues that our concept of the human, right, man, this that we get in the 19th century, right, is not this enduring idea. There's not one concept of the human person that's existed forever. It's this sort of idea that comes about in the 19th century. And he reads it right through, like you said, biology and economics and language. Um, what Sylvia Wynter does is she takes this idea of how we have this concept of man. She says there's actually two concepts of man that she traces through history. And the first one is this sort of man as this political subject, right? The man of enlightenment. And then she says the second one comes about through exclusion, like colonialism and its exclusion of others. And what she's doing when she traces the concept of man is she shows that this is an idea that has been formed in multiple steps. And at each step, like if you look at the world's population, the people that are actually included in this concept of man become smaller and smaller and smaller until it's just Anglo white bourgeois, like, you know, landowner, like the wealthy, and then like everyone else gets excluded from it. Like women are othered, people of other cultures, people of other races and ethnicities, of different social status and class status, they're all excluded in this concept of what it means to be human. And so she gives us this sort of historical reading that really shows us how central colonialism, the Atlantic slave trade, and settler relations are in sort of our intellectual concepts, right? So if you can imagine Foucault shattering my grasp of the history of ideas and philosophy, I read Sylvia Wynter, and this, right, really also destroyed me because
Oh, go
the,
ahead.
yeah, you know, like I came to philosophy. I love Bell Hook's line, like I came to theory because I was hurting. And that's, I feel like I came to philosophy because I was an idealistic person. I thought, here's this tool that can, you know, solve the world's problems. Here's this way of thinking that can, you know, save the world or whatever. And here I see this with Sylvia Wynter, Wynter really gives us this way of understanding how the intellectual traditions, the concepts, all these different tools we have to understand our world cannot be extricated, cannot be pulled apart from colonial violence and oppression.
Well, and I've always found it somewhat problematic that even though Foucault has been very influential in queer theory, in feminist theory, in post-colonial theory as well, because this concept of discourse, for example, has been used by a lot of people to talk about the discourse of patriarchy, or the discourse of compulsive heteronormativity, or the discourse of colonialism. Foucault himself, all things considered, doesn't write about colonialism as much as I would expect, a radical French guy from the 60s, 70s, and 80s to write about colonialism. So he's been sort of criticized for this. He's weirdly silent about French coloniality, and claiming this radical position. But nonetheless, it's true that there is a lot of use of Foucault for post-colonial theory. And it seems like, at least in this case with Sylvia Winters, who is this figure that you're working on now, she's both using Foucault, the sort of the historical method of historicizing and drawing attention to how things change, but then at the same time giving us a critique of Foucault, where she says, look, your historicization of man is just looking at the dominant conception of man. But then there is this other side, let's call it this shadow, or this double, or this duplicate figure of man, which is man as the colonized, or as colonial subject, and those two are not the same. And I'm wondering about what the takeaway from Silvers and from you is about this interaction between Foucauldianism and post-colonial theory.
So, so Winters kind of mentions Foucault, but she's not doing a great deal with him, I would say. And I think I think Black studies, there's a lot of people in Black studies who critique Foucault, not just for being silent on French colonialism, but also there's a lot of ideas that it seems like he actively got from the Black Panthers, and he didn't credit them. And so maybe some of his positions that are particularly radical, he is being inspired by Black thinkers and not crediting them. So there's a lot of, I think they're like bringing Foucault and Winter into dialogue can be kind of problematic for that reason, that Foucault is not really the post-colonial or decolonial thinker we would hope him to be. That's his limitation. So what I kind of tend to think a lot about methodology. That's sort of what I bring to the table as a thinker, and as someone who can read different theorists and kind of bring them together. And what I see happening is I see Winter doing a method that's very similar to Foucault. She's reading different thinkers. She's going to original text. She's reading, like her work is actually really, her work requires a lot of knowledge to read, because she will cover a huge amount of history, and she's reading these very complicated texts from like the 16th century, right? She's looking at Columbus's notes and marginalia, and she's tying together, the biological sciences and literature and all sorts of different things. She'll talk about Nagel's article, "What's It Like to Be a Bat," next to Frantz Fanon, and so she's drawing together all these ideas in a way that I think is very similar to Foucault, where it's super interdisciplinary. It's ignoring these sort of disciplinary borders that people often put up, so that you can have a bigger picture of what is happening. So you can kind of see the interaction between different ideas. Foucault talks about kind of trying to get in there at the level of discourse to see how ideas are fitting together and coming together. And that means you kind of ignore certain assumptions you have about what is not similar or what is similar. And I see Winter doing the same thing with how she crafts these really, really rich histories. And what I see Winter doing differently than Foucault, and this is why I think I've turned to Winter now and am enjoying reading her and thinking with her so much, is Winter's thinking about the present and future a little bit more. Like, what she's saying, what kind of histories do we want to have, right? She has this concept of the human as homo neurons. I don't know if I'm getting the Latin
Mhm.
pronunciation right, but um, Homo sapiens, right, means that we identify humans as thinking, and then there's Homo faber, which is like the maker, so human as a maker who creates things. That's sort of the technological concept of the human. And Winter is arguing we're Homo neurons, right? We narrate, we create stories, we are the storyteller. And that is something that really strikes a chord with me, particularly because I'm someone who did have a sort of historical narrative of the past that keeps getting broken. And it's getting broken because it's a bad history. It's not a helpful history. And in some ways, it's an incriminating way of looking at the past because it is so exclusionary. It's kind of, only looking at very particular traditions and ignoring a great deal of the world. And so Winter challenges me to try to think about how I can be a better historian.
Oh, that's great. And I mean, I think this question about what kinds of histories do we want to write really goes to the heart of it. And, Foucault wrote interesting historical accounts, but I do think in post-colonial thinkers, and for example, I see this in some Caribbean figures like Aimé Césaire, in Frantz Fanon as well. This question that is sort of framed a little bit more aggressively and correctly so about what kinds of histories do we in the present want to tell ourselves about our past? Because that says something no longer about the past, it says something about the present. And so it reminds me, for example, of Frantz Fanon when he writes in Black Skins, White Masks about the way in which the French tell the story about themselves as the descendants of the Gauls. And he says, this makes no sense for a Black French kid from the Caribbean, because
Yeah.
that's not a history that child can assimilate psychically and not sense a deep tension between his racial body and the culture that he's in. So Fanon at some point in that book, and I do see MSSR as doing a similar thing as Winters, as you've described it, it's asking this question of, we tell stories because they satisfy some need in the present. And so it's not that there is history and we just take a picture of it. It's we have to paint it, we have to narrate it, and there are different ways to do that with different political goals, different political effects. And so is there, as a way of concluding, any advice, and I've asked the people who I've interviewed this question at the end,
Oh.
any advice that you have for graduate students who are beginning their encounters with Foucault? What would you give them as a piece of advice of somebody who's sort of like walked that line and gone through that process already?
Well, I think I'm really happy you shared that clip from my journal now, because that just gives your grad students a concept that, reading Foucault can be frustrating and it can uh, be a lot to grapple with. He's giving you some really tough blows in some ways to your way of thinking. And you'll get through it. Maybe you'll even one day write an article about Foucault, or he'll become a way you think about, he'll maybe enter into your mind in a way you didn't expect, where suddenly you find yourself reading the world a particular way, or seeing power structure in a way you hadn't before, or using history in a way you hadn't imagined using history before. And so, yeah, I think it's a really wonderful thing to learn how to think with Foucault. And so if you can bear with maybe some of the confusing moments or the frustrations, it's well worth it.
Great. And I'll end with this random thought that I had in terms of, Foucault as somebody who questions power dynamics, but whose own power dynamics he sometimes didn't question, as you mentioned, with his lack of attribution really of ideas to the sources, like with the Black Panthers. I recently, well, not so recently, maybe a couple of months ago, ran across a piece of writing making a similar claim about Foucault in his relationship with his own students in France, where he, you know, people have always wondered how Foucault had such an encyclopedic knowledge of history, where he could write like an expert about the history of linguistics, the history of biology, the history of like physics even, or like the history of literature and poetry. Like, how do you develop this kind of expertise? And I read that at the time, Foucault was sort of well known for having his graduate students do his dirty work, like just go and do. And so he would ask his graduate students to go and like, hey, you should write a dissertation about the General Hospital in Paris between 1751 and 1753. And then he would ask another one to write another dissertation about something very related. And then he would sort of just like swoop in and take the findings and then present them as his ideas without really citing or recognizing the work of his minions. So anyways, interesting sort of juicy detail about the politics of philosophical production itself.
Oh
um,
my gosh, that's something else. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. That's
and
an abuse of power.
yes, yes. So, well, Becca, thank you very much for doing this interview. And I'm sure the students will really benefit from your insights about the philosophy of art and the history of ideas, and the way in which people are using, such as yourself, Foucault in connection with other discourses like postcolonial theory. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.